Good evening and welcome. My name is John Coatsworth. I'm the Acting Dean of the School of International and Public Affairs here at Columbia. And it's my great pleasure to introduce to you the 2008 InvestCorps lecturer. He is Martin Varsavsky. Martin Varsavsky is an Argentine Spaniard. An Argentine by birth, a Spaniard by residence and entrepreneurship more recently. The founder of 7 companies in the past 20 years. He is a graduate of New York University, where he did his undergraduate years, and then he came all the way up north in the city and got degrees both at SIPA and at the Columbia Business School. Since graduating from SIPA, he's demonstrated that life after an international affairs degree, especially if you combine it with a business degree, can be quite exciting. Indeed, even before he graduated from NYU, he started his first business called Urban Capital Corporation and was one of the early leaders in the loft movement in downtown Manhattan. This was soon followed in 1986 by Medicorp Services, a Canadian biotechnology company which was a pioneer in AIDS and PSA testing. His third business, Viatel Limited, was his first venture into the telecom world. It was founded in 1990. That's the company that's best known for inventing callback and building the first pan-European fiber optic network ahead of regulatory liberalization. Mr. Varsavsky's best-known ventures were founded during the last decade, that is, in the 1990s. In 1998, he started Jazztel Telecommunications, Spain's second largest publicly traded telecom operator. In 1999, he founded Ya.com, Y-A.com, which means already.com, Spain's third largest internet website and DSL provider that includes the second largest Spanish language web agency, www.viajar.com. Not all of Mr. Varsavsky's enterprises were great successes. He bought or started a company which he called Einsteinit in Germany in 2000 and sold it in 2003 for about what it cost him to get it started. Of course, he didn't lose his shirt, which has happened to a lot of people in this business and at about that time. Martin's current venture, Mr. Varsavsky's current venture is FON, an innovative Wi-Fi startup founded in February 2006 and headquartered in Madrid, Spain. It has about 100 employees around the world, and its mission is to make Wi-Fi universal and free by creating a unified global community of members who share Wi-Fi. The FON community already has close to 700,000 members, or at least when this was written, probably more now, and has become the world's largest Wi-Fi community. In addition to his for-profit activities, some of which have been incredibly successful, Mr. Varsavsky also engages in not-for-profit activities. He manages the Varsavsky Foundation, which founded 2 large educational projects in Latin America, Educ.ar in Argentina and Educar Chile in Chile, and the Safe Democracy Foundation. He was, between 2001 and 2005, he served as Ambassador at Large of Argentina, and he is now a member of the Board of Advisors of the William Jefferson Clinton Foundation and of the Instituto de Empresa, where he teaches, Spain's leading business school. He's written extensively on business and public issues, both in El País in Spain, in Newsweek, and elsewhere. He's a frequent speaker at conferences around the world and an active blogger. You'll tell us what your blog address is, I hope. Among other awards, he received in 2004 the Pickering Prize from Columbia University for outstanding achievement, and I'm delighted to report to you that his daughter will be matriculating Columbia freshman this coming fall. Mr. Varsavsky.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thanks for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me. And what I wanted to speak about today is it's sort of about starting businesses in Europe versus starting businesses in the States, but in general about the situation in which we're in Europe now and the situation that I think the United States is in from the perspective of a person doing a startup or a new business. That's really what I had in mind. Having said this, because as the Dean kindly pointed out, there's a lot of other things that I'm involved with, and we're a small group, so I'm perfectly open to talk about also my not-for-profit activities and what my foundations do. But when I came to SIPA, I already had an idea that I was going to combine whatever knowledge I had about the world with something practical, something that I could get going, and that's what I've done since I've been here, and I started 7 businesses, both in the States and in Europe, and that's what I want to talk to you about. I also think there's a misconception that the U.S. is such an easy place to start a business and that Europe is a very difficult place to start a business, and I wanted to address that misconception because I think Europe has greatly changed. I also think America has greatly changed since I moved from the United States to Europe, but I think unfortunately it's changed for the worse. I think it's been the America that I knew in the 90s. I think unfortunately there have been a number of changes that have made this country worse off in general, but a little also worse off for business creation, with the most obvious one being that the dollar is such a devalued currency now, the peso dollar as they call it now. And I think that it's shocking to see the dollar at almost 160 to the euro, right? So the first comment regarding currencies, you could say, well, what do I care, right? What do I care? Well, it is relevant. Before coming, I landed at around 2, and I had one business meeting before coming here. It was with OPIC. Okay, OPIC is this American organization that helps fund investment overseas. And another activity that I'm involved with that hasn't been mentioned is alternative energy, and I've been a significant investor in alternative energy. I've been building a lot of solar farms and wind farms, and so the company that I was an initial investor in is a company that now, after 3 years, is worth around $1.1 billion, and it's a company that builds solar farms and wind farms. And I was talking to this representative of OPIC he said that OPIC had committed a very sizable amount for investing in renewable energies, and he said $500 million, right? And it reminded me a little of the Austin Power movie where he wakes up and he says like $1 million, and I'm not saying that $500 million is not a lot of money, but in alternative energies the investments are huge. I mean, in a small solar farm in Spain costs $50 million, a small one, a very small one, that the U.S. government sets aside $500 million. You say, well, $500 million, but to invest in alternative energy in the rest of the world, it's really a tiny amount of money. It's like $500 million is not what it used to be. $500 million used to be over €500 million, and now $500 million is like 300 million euros or something like that. It's like a rapidly shrinking economy. The America is a rapidly shrinking economy when you look at it from the euro or the pound or the Swiss franc or the yen. It's like a rapidly shrinking economy, right? And the global, it's hard to be a global superpower with a mini currency, right? It's hard. It's like, even if you invade a country, then you can't afford a Coke there, or you can't afford a sandwich there. You know, it's kind of like a paradox that you can actually do such supposedly amazing military feats and then have a currency that's just disappearing in front of your eyes. So that has created a problem for people like myself, because the companies that I build, many of them are incredibly risky companies. One of them is not that I sold it for the one that this Einstein company that went poorly. it's a company where it's not that I sold it for what I invested. No, I lost like 35 million euros in that company. Let's say over $50 million. Sometimes the companies that are built are very successful. Sometimes they're significant failures. Now, the sad part of the disappearing dollar is that there's a wonderful thing about this country, and there's a wonderful thing about the United States of America in general, is the spirit of entrepreneurship. With a disappearing or rapidly shrinking dollar, at FON, when we did our first round in 2005, we were valuing our company in euros. But FON, which is now the largest Wi-Fi network in the world, but still a very risky venture, let's say, still a high-risk venture, the sad part is that we still don't have in Europe enough money, enough funds for very risky ventures. And you have to come to the States. For example, my partners at FON, some are European, but mostly they're Google, an American company, eBay, another American company, Sequoia, an American fund. And then I have Index, which is a European company, and then I have British Telecom, which is obviously a European company, but I still have mostly American companies. And they think in dollars. And on the last round, which we did in January, our valuation was beginning to sound shockingly high for Americans, just like going for dinner in Europe is beginning to be, a shockingly high bill experience. So in a person's level, just going out for dinner, when you go talk to the guys at Sequoia or you talk to the guys at any other company, they think, oh, these valuations are insane for American standards, but it's because of the dollar. It's because of the dollar. It's because it used to be 1-to-1 and now it's 1.6-to-1. So the thing is, Europe now has to wean itself from American funding for high-risk ventures, and it has to come up with its own funding. But the Europeans have a very conservative outlook on life, and that is the difficulty there, and as such, and they have a very, very little tolerance for failure, right? I was looking at a very interesting statistic, by the way, which is that which says something about failure, which is that everybody knows that homicides rates are much higher in America than in Europe, and they are. And Americans are much more likely to kill other fellow Americans. But the Europeans are much more likely to kill themselves, okay? So if suicide is a form of homicide to yourself, then there is, and I think this is a little something about sometimes a sad aspect of a European outlook on life, right? Of course, it's horrible to kill another person, but there's something to be said about defeat, a sense of defeat, right? That many times people in Europe have, and so this positivity that America has is a wonderful thing. But in Europe, the funding from American sources is becoming less and less, and that's why now we have to develop our own sources. Having said that, Europe has a lot of advantages over the United States. Well, the size of the European economy now measured in dollars is significantly bigger than the US economy. The number of people who live in Europe, the income, the people, the 450 million people now, the European Union, and the euro itself, which was supposed to be, I mean, I had dinner with Jim Wolfenson's house like maybe 5 years ago, and the dinner conversation was that the euro just couldn't work. How could you get these people who used to kill each other, massacre each other, destroy each other, a continent in which there were still, to some extent, some genocidal activity going on, Yugoslavia, and all the problems that Europe had had. How could this currency possibly succeed? And yet, it's been obviously a great success. But I don't think the success has a lot to do with anything other than some discipline that Europeans have and Americans don't vis-a-vis paying taxes and just, not spending more than what you collect, right? And not engaging in crazy wars, engaging to some extent in war, but not engaging in crazy wars. As we were talking about before, a lot of people in Europe think that America made that the invasion of Iraq is a business for the United States. And I many times try to explain that even if America could keep all the exports of Iraq, they would be less than 30 billion, and America is spending 5 times that just to be there. And of course, America is not keeping the money like as if it was a generalized theft operation. If anything, the invasion of Iraq is an enormous loss for America, and it's also that something that has brought America into deficit, a significant deficit, and has also made the dollar sink and be where it is. The other very bad thing about doing business in America is lawyers. And without offending any lawyer, any one of you who may be a lawyer, lawyers in America add, but not just lawyers and the enormous uncertainty of the legal system. When I was building businesses in America, in Europe you kind of know that things are legal or illegal. And many things in America are a gray area. Like the lawyers would tell me, we can take an aggressive position, a more conservative position. And I was just saying, look, I don't want to take a position. I just want to know, is this legal or is this illegal, you know? And then the frivolous lawsuits and the surprising, so there's a great deal of uncertainty when you do business in America as to what's going to happen. You may get sued, you may get sued very, very easily, you may get sued. For example, in the areas that I work with in high technology, there's in open source, like we use a lot of open source software. And open source, this is wonderful, mostly European, but greatly American too, motivated movement of people who write code and give it away for free. Well, the only country where people who do open source are many times concerned is the States, because even though they work for free, they can still get sued. And they get sued, oh, you're infringing this patent, you're infringing the other patent. Because in America, another thing that is difficult is that the patent law and the concept of intellectual property in America is too vast. Like there's a lot of areas which in Europe are not covered by intellectual property, that in America are covered by intellectual property. And if you're a startup, you have to be very concerned about people suing you. They can sue you out of existence, right? They can sue you out of existence. So it's an added risk. It's an added risk of doing business in the States. Now, what are the negative things that people say about Europe all the time? They say, well, the labor laws. That is the one thing that people talk about that are so bad in Europe, the labor laws. And I think they're pretty bad in some countries in Europe. And I think they're pretty bad for people in startups because in some places, like I've done business in France, and you have a person for 4 months who doesn't work out, and you have to pay them 6 months' salary to fire them. And you've only had them 4 months. So not only that, in France, there's some buildings that cut off the electricity to force people to go home early, and this whole issue of not working late. And so the labor laws are they're very complicated. In Germany, there's regulations as to how many meters away from a window an employee could be, and buildings are designed to be long and narrow, so people are never far from a window. Hardly the case in the States. And so it's an overregulated market for labor laws, and many people in Europe have this idea that the government or the entrepreneur should take care of them from the time they're born until they retire, which should be as early as possible, and working for the least amount of hours as possible. And that is extremely negative for startups. Having said this, there's a lot of people in Europe who love their work. Let's begin with that. This concept that in Europe many people have, that work is punishment and therefore you should work as little as possible. That is the general concept that exists in Europe. So since work is punishment, you should go from Victorian times where people were working 80 hours a week, then 60 hours a week, then 40 hours a week, and hopefully one day nobody will be punished and we will not work, right? That's kind of like the idea. And I think that this is changing. Okay, I mean that the good news is that this is changing. There's a lot of people, I was going to say young people, but some young, some not so young, who are different, who actually are finding, like in America, many people, satisfaction through work. And that they have a sense that work is a life-enhancing experience, an experience that will make them better off. Now, the problem is that many of these people are sometimes, there's a peer pressure. When you get a group of these people together with the rest of the people in Europe, there's a peer pressure for them to go home early, not work as hard. I mean, there's just like here, there's the opposite peer pressure. And that's something that I think has to change. But for example, now there's amazing startups in Scandinavia. There's great startups in almost everywhere in Europe. There's internet startups that I've invested in France. And there's people in small offices hiding and working late. Okay, there's a lot of... Now, having said on this, by the way, there's something for anybody who's interested in economics here that it's still a mystery to me, which is the opposite, which is how is it that Americans work so hard and yet don't do better than the Europeans who work so little? You know, that's also something that you have to wonder. I mean, why is it that the average American doesn't live better, is not better off than the average French or the average German, when the average French and the average German, well, the French especially, is generally many times on strike and many times on vacation, and you say, well, how do they function here? How can these countries do so well? Okay, so that makes you feel that this whole concept of staying late and working extra hours and working so hard, that maybe there is something to be said for quality time at work. You know, like people talk about quality time at parenting. It's not the amount of time, it's quality time with your children. I'm not sure that is true, but I think for work, it's certainly true. When Europeans work, when the French work, if they work such few hours and achieve the same level of GDP, they have to be doing something right when they work, right? And there has to be a lot of pretend to work going on in America. If people work so many hours and they only achieve the same results. And by the way, the ultimate pretend to work place is probably the East Asia, because in Japan they have this thing that they work until the last train, right, which is midnight, when the last train is the last running metro. We have an office in Japan, and with all respect to my Japanese employees, the other day I was there with them, and we were talking about this, and I say, guys, don't you get the sense that staying until midnight every day, and the whole country stays until midnight, but the GDP hasn't basically moved in the last 20 years? Don't you think that there must be something going on in this country, that people are pretending to work or something like that, or that the work is not yielding the results it should because for the last 20 years you've been going home at midnight and the GDP hasn't moved, right? So there's something to be said for Europe, which is the continent where people work the least and achieve the most, okay? Which is not a bad title to have, okay? So in terms of startups, I would say America is great for raising capital, but it has a devalued currency, and it's getting harder and harder to raise money for projects outside of America. It also is getting very hard for American companies to open offices overseas, because it's like they can't afford the employees. America has traditionally made enormous dividends out of multinationals who send money home and so on. And the ones who are established, they're in great shape, and American companies are enjoying phenomenal profits made overseas. But it's very difficult for a startup. So I see more and more, I see Silicon Valley startups who come to see me, and people who come to, and they want to get started in Europe, then they have to come very ingenious ways, because they can't afford offices in Europe, or they can't afford to get going in Europe. When it gets to profits, though, you probably will be surprised, but close to a fifth 20% of the profits of Google come out of the UK alone. The UK. You say Google is in the whole world. Well, the UK alone is close to 20% of the profits of Google. Okay, so because what's happening, again, because the currencies are so strong in Europe that when you make profits and you bring them into dollars, they're just huge, you know. So more and more American companies have a dependency, multinational companies, on the profits they make overseas, also because of this relationship. So I think what Europe needs is a little change of perspective vis-a-vis risk, a change of perspective vis-a-vis labor laws. And if I can summarize, I think what America needs certainly is less military adventurism and less enormous spending outside of the States for futile or, you know, kind of useless reasons. And try to work with others on international. I mean, Bush Sr. certainly was pretty smart about financing his war, you know, certainly much more than W. And so I think that there's, and as far as the next 5 years, though, I think the situation may get better for the United States. I think it is unlikely that the euro will be at 2. Okay, when it got to 150, I was already. But I think the next president, whoever it is, will inherit it. I'm surprised they're competing to be president of and inheriting the mess that Bush is going to give them, because it's such a disaster. I think with the foreign policy, the economy, it's hardly a job anybody would want to be president of the United States now. But they're fighting for it. And I think that somebody will inherit that job and hopefully will organize things here in the States. And I would say that the States has everything going for it to be a better performing country in the next 5 years than in the last 5 years. So hopefully things will get better here. But in the meantime, I think that the surprising outperformer of the world in the last 5 years has been Europe. And I think that if any one of you is thinking of building a business in Europe, or coming to Europe to do things, I think there's tremendous opportunity there. And now maybe we should do some Q&A and just talk more concretely about the subjects that may interest you. Okay.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you.
Floor is open for questions.
Yes. Well, I would say, if I had to say just one, is that it was a technology that came too early. The concept of EinsteinNet was cloud computing, which is something that's very much in fashion now, but I did it in 2001. The whole idea of EinsteinNet was that people were going to do everything online, that they were going to do their mail online, like Gmail, that they were going to do their spreadsheets online, like Google Docs, like a lot of things that Google is doing now, we were trying to do in 2001, and it was way too early. We were also doing it in Germany, and I did it in Germany because Germany is the strongest or largest economy in Europe, and I very much wanted to have a company started there, but I didn't know. I would say Germans are more interested in proven technology than the latest technology. There are people who like reliability and things to go well, so I also learned that it's almost easier to get something started someplace else, especially in the States, bring it to Germany. But the main lesson was that. The main lesson was that we were way ahead. And with FON, my company now, I'm very conscious of that. And I think that even though Wi-Fi is used in a lot of places, only since we started FON that the Sony PSP, which is a Wi-Fi only device, the Nintendo DS, a Wi-Fi only device, like a lot of new devices, well, the iPhone, which it works so well with Wi-Fi, like a lot of things we also did very early. Except at this time, I think I have just more money to wait, you know. So I think we can wait.
There's a microphone there, so if it'll be easier for us to record your questions if you step to it to ask questions. I have a question. It has to do with the other side of the quality time on the job analysis that you gave, and that is, there's been a disturbing tendency over the last 20 or 30 years. Disturbing, that is, if you're on this side of the Atlantic Ocean, in which Europeans have grown taller than Americans, and they've begun to live longer, but significantly taller and significantly greater longevity. And the curious thing about this is you would imagine that that reflects the greater inequalities in the American distribution of wealth and income, and the absence of a safety net here. But it doesn't, because rich people in the United States are shorter and live less, live a shorter time, than rich people in Europe, just as poor people do. So and the difference doesn't vary a great deal by income level. So I think, in addition to the quality of time on the job, there seems to be a quality of life off the job issue that also would seem to favor the Europeans, at least in the last decades. Yeah.
No, that's very interesting. I also write occasionally for the Huffington Post. It's an American blog. You heard about it? Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I wrote a story in the Huffington Post about something similar to this, about related to the comparison of the healthcare system I had an accident in France and I had an accident in the States on 2 occasions in my life, and I was comparing how I was treated, my emergency treatment, my emergency care in the States and in Europe. And the one in the States, actually, I had here while I was at Columbia University. I was playing squash and somebody hit me in the head with a racket and I was bleeding. I went to the hospital over there, the St. Luke's Hospital, and the one in Paris was like 2 years ago or a year ago. And I was, the first thing I was commenting there is about the treatment that in France they have this, you arrive with an injury and they don't ask you any questions whatsoever. They don't even know who you are, and they only ask you questions about what happened, your injury, this and that, but it's not, of course they don't ask you if you have medical insurance, if you have anything like that. They don't even ask you your name, really. They don't ask you to fill out forms. I remember bleeding in this hospital here and like filling out the forms and telling them all about this and that, and it was really brutal. It was brutal. And by the way, Japan is one of these brutal countries too. And in terms of, the other day I was with a dear friend of mine, a fellow entrepreneur, Yatsuo, who had appendicitis, and we were in Japan. And we were in the ambulance, and if we hadn't had a person who spoke Japanese there, the way emergency care works in Japan is the ambulance comes, and then the ambulance starts asking you what you have and starts negotiating before they take you to the hospital. Like, we're not even entering the hospital until we know, about you and that you can pay and all that, and I was horrified. So, in Europe, certainly medical care is easier accessible, and that may account to some extent about why people live longer. Also, but I've seen the studies that you've seen, and I've seen that they have studies where people who have access to medical care, who are well off and all that, and I also was trying to understand why is it that the same well-off people, why. I was actually at a conference in the States where the head of Merck was speaking, and there's some people in America who just hate the European health system, and especially they tend to work for pharmaceutical companies. And this guy was going on and on about what a disastrous health system we have in Europe, because he didn't know I was the only non-American in the audience, and he didn't know I was there. It wasn't a huge group. And then I asked him the same question. I said, if our system is so bad, how come we live so much longer, right? Isn't survival the ultimate test of health, that you survive and you don't die? That seems to be a conclusive proof, And he said that they had no clue, and this is the head of Merck. And he said, we also don't really understand why people. So there's a lot of theories about the diet, about this, about that, about why is it that people in the same income level, with the same, and America is supposed to have the best medicine in the world, the best, but also people, it's not that they live longer like 6 months. They live a lot longer, right? Like many years. And you may be onto something, which is the stress levels, or the demands that are put on the American population, and including the very successful and the upper income people, and maybe that kills them sooner, or something like that. There's people live very long lives in Spain, where I where I live. But actually, people live longer lives in many, many more countries than in the United States. So it's. I don't know what the answer is. Yes.
Please step to the microphone.
You had mentioned that it's easier to raise money in Europe, but that it's obviously harder to open up startups easier to raise money in the United States, but harder to open up startups in Europe. And I just thought with the advent of the European Union and as more legislation is becoming unified across Europe, that would sort of alleviate the problems that entrepreneurs face. Would you mind commenting about that?
Well, Europe has greatly improved. I lived in America until 95. I moved to Europe in 95, and it's certainly easier, much easier, to raise money now than it used to be. But the craziest ideas only get financed in America. Like the ideas that are just far out and like FON. I mean, the concept of FON, when I was raising money for FON, I could only raise money for FON in America, because the concept of FON is that everybody gets a router. They go to FON.com, they buy a $30 router, they put it in their window, and they get most of the Wi-Fi for themselves, but a small portion of the Wi-Fi becomes a public signal that creates a public phone network that anybody can connect to it, right? That is the concept of phone. And it's actually been more successful in Asia and in Europe than in the United States. I'm trying to make it more of a success in the United States, and it's been a moderate success in the United States, but let's say the sharing culture is more of a European thing and an Asian thing. And in America, we have a lot of people who are concerned about security and bandwidth depletion, that they're concerned that am I going to be depleted of my own bandwidth, or am I going to get viruses, or am I going to get somebody in my driveway, you know, like there's unusual concerns that we haven't seen in other places in the world. And still, even though Europe is a more natural market for phone, it is very difficult to finance a company like phone in Europe. I do have European investors, but they only came after they saw the Americans taking the lead. Okay? I think America is a pretty divided country, by the way, I really personally have the America I love and the America I hate. It just happens to be in the same country. But there's really seems to be two very different groups of people. And the America I love is the Silicon Valley America, the America of the risk takers, the America of the entrepreneurs, the America of the Nobel Prizes, the America of a lot of things, the science that there is in America. But the America I hate is the bureaucratic America, the law fixated America, is the military America, is the but these two make one nation. You know, in Europe we save a lot of money for not spending so much in the military. That certainly, but we have a fear of failure, and that's unfortunate. That's unfortunate. So I think the best thing is to raise your money here and do a startup there. Yes, Yana.
So just on that note, just on a personal level.
Please step to the microphone.
So formal. Anyway, the question is, if you never had been here in the States, would you have done the same thing? Or
yes, no, that's a good question. That, of course, my American education greatly helped me, and my daughter, as was mentioned, I have 4 children, and they go from 17 to 1, and so they cover a different group. And the 17-year-old is coming here, and I think I always thought that American culture in some way should be X-rated. You know, you come here when you're 18. That would make a lot of sense. I think it's better to come here after European high school. I think European high school is great. I think European university is generally very poor. I think American high school is pretty poor, but I think American universities are the best in the world. So if you can combine a European high school and American universities, it's a great thing. And I had an Argentine high school and an American university. It made me bold to come to the university here. It made me. America is a country where there's no limit to this boldness or the kind of dreams you can have, and Europe is very much of a continent to put you in your place, that you are where you are, and you're probably never going to be anything else. You know, there's I was telling the dean here that I gave a speech last week at the School of Engineering in Madrid, and I asked the question to the students there. I said, please raise your hand who thinks that they're going to be successful. And there were over 100 students there, and only 4 raised their hand. And that to me said a lot. Only 4 people thought they were going to be successful. I did the same thing at the School of Business in Madrid, and actually almost everybody thought they were going to be successful. So it's not just Spain. But I do think that, yes, my American education has helped me. And most of the successful entrepreneurs in Europe, or many, have studied in the States. And there's something about a sense of accomplishment that you can have.
We're asking you to step to the microphone because we're recording this, so we can hear your question, so please.
What would you say is the 2 or 3 best countries to start a company in Europe in?
Yeah, well, that's a good question because Europe is a very diverse, very diverse. So is America, by the way. It's not the same thing to start a company in Arkansas or start a company in Silicon Valley. And even a friend of mine, Quincy Smith, who runs CBS, I saw today in the paper that he's moving his division from New York to Silicon Valley just to be, you know, even though it's CBS, okay, and obviously they're well plugged in New York. So even in the States, it makes a big difference where you are. And in Europe, I think it makes a big difference too. I think the Scandinavian countries are amazing. They have an amazing startup culture. Well, I should say Sweden, especially Sweden. Okay, I've had a lot of contact with entrepreneurs in Sweden. They have and my partners at FON are also Nicolas and Janos, Nicolas Sennström and Janos Friis, who started Skype and started now Just and so on, and they're Danish and Swedish. And these 2 countries, which are countries of a tiny, a very, very small amount of people. There's more people in Madrid than I think in all of Denmark, and there's more people, there's a 1/5 of the people in Sweden than in Spain or something like that. So I think it's 9 million people and 5 million people, something like that. I hope I don't get it too wrong. So these are very small countries with extremely strong entrepreneurial cultures. Finland is another tiny, tiny country in terms of population, but it has Nokia and it has a number of entrepreneurs there. And then the problem is more with the large countries of Europe, which are so mixed. Like Germany has some amazing entrepreneurs, but enormous bureaucracy and very, very difficult labor laws, although that's changing. France, the same. There's a lot of my dear friend Loïc Lemer, who's a top French entrepreneur, just moved to Silicon Valley for his new startup because he felt it was very difficult to do it in France. Tariq Krim, who's another French entrepreneur, friend of mine who did NetVibes, also has an office in Paris, but then an office in Silicon Valley. But I still think that's because the European environment is so tough. Once you make it in Europe, once your companies, and I'm talking now about very large companies, the European very large companies operating in that environment, if you manage to make a profit in countries where sort of everything is against you, financing, labor laws, everything, then you're so good that you tend to be incredibly successful in the rest of the world. Like Carrefour, for example, you see Supermarché everywhere. You land in Tokyo, there's a Carrefour. These are companies that are comparable or bigger than Walmart or companies of this size. There's enormous companies that are built in Europe and tend to go everywhere. Spain is a great country for startups. I really, really recommend Spain. It's the labor laws are there, but they're reasonable. For example, when you hire somebody, if you have to let them go, you pay them a month and a half salary for every year they work for you, which I think is reasonable. By the way, I believe in compensation and I believe in fair labor laws. I don't want to sound like I think that the reasonable labor laws are somewhere in between those of the United States and those of Germany. They're not only those of the United States, because I don't think it's fair that somebody who's worked many years for a company can be laid off overnight without compensation and so on. So I think, but some places they overdo it. Okay, so Spain is a great country for startups. Italy is a very difficult country to do business with. I have found, at least and I speak Italian, and No, I love Italy, but to do business, Italy has a lot of complexities and arcane labor laws, and very few foreigners make it in Italy, and it's just very, very difficult. So I think the best place is Switzerland is a country where many entrepreneurs are going. Yahoo is now moving their headquarters from the UK to Switzerland, partly for tax reasons, but the web was invented in Switzerland. I mean, it's a lot of Switzerland. It's a great country in many ways. Ireland is a great little country, but again, tiny. You could never do a business selling stuff to the Irish. It's a tiny market. It's kind of like Israel, but then it's an amazing place to do business from. Just like Israel is a great country to do business from, Ireland is a great country to do business from in the technology world. That's summary.
Want to step to the microphone? Thank you.
I'm interested in your perspective on the sort of the bigger picture of the flow of risk capital. If you think about it as there are sources of capital, there are such as institutional investors mostly, sovereign funds, huge sources of capital. There are conduits, the general partners who run private equity funds, venture capital funds, and then there are targets. You're talking about European targets. But there's massive changes in these other two parts. There's a huge flow of capital to the sovereign funds. And there are European-based institutional investors who have a great appetite for risk capital. I'm talking about risk capital, not investing in stocks and bonds. There's Advent International just announced the other day they raised 6 billion euros of capital for a buyout fund. It was twice oversubscribed. These funds go into Central and Eastern Europe and invest in projects there that one could argue have a high degree of risk. So I'm wondering how these shifts that are happening in the sources of capital, massive amounts of money going, oil, petrodollars going into sovereign funds, for example, wealth being generated in China through export revenues, at that level. And then are the European in-betweens, the venture and the buyout funds, really operating optimally in order to then, and why is there a seeming emphasis on risk in the form of investing in Central Eastern Europe, for example, in larger things, or even in the case of the Arab funds investing in Citibank, for example, which is pretty damn high risk. How is the risk of venture capital type, startup type investment, how does it position itself in that sort of overall
Well,
framework?
I used to be on the board of APACs, okay, APACs in Europe, which had an Advent and APACs were investors in Jastel, the company that I built in 1998. And it's interesting what happened to those firms, because they went from being risk takers in entrepreneurs who were doing startups like myself into doing buyouts. And they raised huge funds. They went from having small funds, investing in entrepreneurs, to doing huge funds in buyouts. And Permira is one now, a very, very large one. I think they have 11 billion euros. And so what these companies try to do? So Europe now is finding itself with a lot of cash from these people. They're also finding themselves a lot of cash because the Arab investors are concerned about the dollar ever collapsing and all that. And like the oil, the price of oil has gone from $26 to $112 yesterday, but it has gone from 28 euros from the mid-2003 to 70 euros. So we felt the oil going up, but we haven't felt it the way America has felt it, right? We haven't felt it. And so a lot of the Arabs, who in any case feel they don't like them in America and they like to vacation in Europe anyway, they see their savings in dollars kind of dwindling and the savings in euros doing better. They want to invest in Europe. So now you have the petrodollars who want to invest in Europe. You have the Russians, which now have gone from being a $100 billion economy to being over $1 trillion economy. Spain has gone from being like a 400 billion economy to over $1 trillion economy since '95, and now, and so you have these enormous pools of funds looking for things to do. So then you have the accession countries, right? That like the new countries. So you get like 100 million people into the European Union Now, the European Union has been an incredibly successful experiment absorbing former dictatorial countries and converting formerly dictatorial authoritarian countries into quite democratic countries. I mean, you can still argue that those twins who are in Poland and so on are not the most democratic people in the world. I don't remember exactly their name, the president and his identical twin. But I think that they have these sort of fascist tendencies, but they're kept. They know that if they go too far, the European Union will intervene. So the European Union has become a force for democracy in these places. So capital feels secure that these countries will stay with the framework of Europe, which is a framework of democracies, a framework of fiscal responsibility. So even though you said that these countries are very risky countries, a lot of the risk of doing business in these countries have been lower by them belonging to the European Union. And I would consider them by now very low-risk countries compared to countries that are not in the European Union. Or, for example, if you compare Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia with next door Belarus, like Belarus is like I don't think people are thinking of doing their next business venture there, right? So it's extremely risky. But what do the funds do when they go into these countries? Well, they invest in very large established businesses. So they go into countries that are used to be risky. The risk has come down, and they invest in real estate, they invest in agricultural businesses, they invest in food businesses, they invest in hospitality, they invest in large hotel chains. The Spaniards, who have been investing a lot in real estate, the market is doing poorly there. They go to Eastern Europe. So I think there's still a lack of capital for what I do, which is extremely high risk tech ventures, but I agree with you, there's a lot of money now available for the others.
Perhaps I could ask a final question. Could you tell us something about the foundation that you founded and its history? I know that you have a history of being concerned with human rights issues as well as education. What are the steps that take you from founding companies and becoming an entrepreneur that knows so much about capital markets and that is so successful in the business world? How do you get from that to someone who invests in a foundation and has these other concerns?
Well, the foundation I'm referring to, which is called Safe Democracy, and you can look it up on the internet, safedemocracy.org. I think that when I was looking at building a foundation in Europe, it's interesting, but in Europe it's difficult to do foundations because a lot of the room that it's taken by foundations in America is taken by the government in Europe, right? So in Europe people pay more taxes, or lately I would say the same as in America, but there's more money available in Europe for education, for a lot of things. So when I was thinking of building a foundation in Europe, I realized that there wasn't a lot to do as opposed to the other foundation I had built in Argentina, that there's so much to do vis-a-vis education. So I focused on the issue of human rights and terrorism, especially because, and we hosted the largest conference that was ever organized on terrorism with many heads of states, and we did it together with the Club de Madrid, which is the club of the former heads of state. We had 1,300 experts on terrorism, but my main hidden agenda, which I can now say, I guess, but I wasn't so open about it then because I wanted to, I didn't want to have my agenda. I wanted the conference to be a place for debate, but I can tell you now, my concern was that terrorism I grew up in a country, Argentina, where terrorism was actually a problem of the state. My cousin was taken in the middle of the night by the government of Argentina into a plane and thrown in the sea to his death. He was only 17. Because when I was growing up, the fascist government of Argentina was actually massively killing its supposed opponents, even though my cousin was only 17. So I grew up in an environment of state terrorism, and I was very concerned about the practices of the United States government, that it was looking, let's say, for Zarqawi in Fallujah, and it would go and bomb and, kill thousands of people just trying to get Zarqawi, right? And I felt that there should be a more targeted way of trying to get Zarqawi. And in any case, after you got Zarqawi, my feeling was you had to put him on trial, and I just didn't agree with this concept of having a war on terror as sort of. And so my feeling was Spain had a lot to teach about dealing with terrorism, because in Spain we had been dealing with ETA, and we had been dealing also with Islamic terrorism to a great extent recently. And because America had, September 11, we had March 11th, and we had 200 people killed and 1,000 people injured, and so this was in the first year anniversary of March 11th, and so a lot of people came from the States, including Al Gonzalez and people from the Bush administration and a lot of members, but the idea was to give a European view of how to deal with terrorism, which was to be tough, but to deal with terrorism mainly as an intelligent police judicial problem and not as a military problem. It's just a different view on terrorism. And if you want to protect yourself from terrorism, you have to have effective police, you have to have a lot of things, by the way, that America has too, but my belief was that the likelihood of further terrorist attacks was enhanced by doing things that would actually anger a lot of people in the Islamic world and make them more likely to be recruited to be terrorists. And so we had that conference, and then we had Safe Democracy, and we still have Safe Democracy as a series of conferences, as a think tank, as a publication, a web publication, and that's what my foundation does in Europe.
Martin Varsavsky, thank you very much for a fascinating talk, for wonderful answers to penetrating questions, and I hope that you'll come back again soon.
Thanks for having me.